Every morning at exactly 5:30 a.m., Margaret Williams unlocked the heavy oak door of the penthouse that had become her second home. The silence inside was thick and expensive, the kind that only money could buy. For 12 years, she had walked these marble floors, dusted these priceless paintings, and kept the secrets hidden behind these walls. At 48 years old, Margaret moved through the sprawling Manhattan apartment like a dancer who knew every step by heart. She could navigate the entire place in complete darkness if needed. The kitchen first, where she would start the Italian coffee machine that cost more than most people's cars. Then to the dining room, where she would iron the Wall Street Journal and place it exactly where Richard Hartwell expected to find it. Richard was a man who lived by routines, and Margaret had memorized every single one. His black coffee had to be served in the blue ceramic mug, never the white one. His breakfast plate needed to be warmed for exactly 90 seconds. His lucky fountain pen, a gift from his late father, had to be positioned 3 inches from whatever documents awaited his morning review. These details mattered to Richard, though he never said so out loud. Margaret just knew. She had started, working for him when he was still building his tech empire, back when he actually noticed the people around him. Those early days, he would sometimes chat with her about the weather or ask about her family. But success had a way of making people invisible to each other. Now Richard barely looked up when she entered a room. She had become part of the furniture, reliable and unnoticed. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. She knew more about Richard's life than anyone else in the world. She knew he kept a photo of his deceased son hidden in his desk drawer. She knew he called his elderly mother every Tuesday at 3 p.m. sharp. She knew he suffered from insomnia and would sometimes wander the apartment at 2 a.m., staring out at the city lights. She had seen him cry exactly 3 times in 12 years, always while looking at old family photos. But Richard knew almost nothing about her. He had never asked about her own son, never inquired about where she lived or what she did when she wasn't maintaining his perfect world. To him, Margaret was simply the woman who made sure his life ran smoothly, like a well-oiled machine that required no attention as long as it kept working. What Richard didn't know was that Margaret's world was falling apart, piece by piece, day by day. Every morning when she prepared his gourmet breakfast, she wondered if she would have enough money to buy groceries for her own family. Every time she polished his expensive silverware, she thought about the medical bills piling up on her kitchen table back in Brooklyn. Her son David was 16 and dying. The diagnosis had come 6 months ago, delivered in a sterile hospital, room that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the doctors had called it, using clinical words that couldn't capture the terror of watching your child waste away. The standard treatments hadn't worked. David's body had rejected everything they tried, leaving them with one last hope: an experimental treatment available at only 3 hospitals in the entire country. The cost was staggering: $340,000, a number so large it seemed made up, like something from a movie about desperate people in impossible situations. Margaret's insurance company had denied the claim twice, hiding behind policy language that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. She had appealed, pleaded, and even cried during a phone call with a claims representative who sounded bored by her desperation. Margaret had tried everything. She had taken out a second mortgage on her small apartment, maxing out credit cards she never thought she would need to use. She had swallowed her pride and asked relatives for money, watching. Their faces changed when she mentioned the amount needed. Most promised to help but never called back. A few sent small checks with apologetic notes, amounts that wouldn't even cover David's medication for a week. She had applied for grants, written letters to charities, and even started an online fundraising page that raised less than $3,000 despite her sharing it everywhere she could think of. The math was simple and cruel. She needed hundreds of thousands, and she had barely scraped together a few thousand. The worst part was watching David pretend to be okay. Her brilliant, funny son, who wanted to be a teacher someday, had stopped, talking about the future. He still smiled when she visited the hospital, still asked about her work, but she could see the fear in his eyes. He was trying to be brave for her, the same way she was trying to be strong for him. Every night, Margaret would sit at her kitchen table with a calculator and a pile of bills, trying to find money that didn't exist. She would add and subtract the same numbers over and over, as if pure determination could somehow make the math work out differently. But the truth was unchanging and harsh. Without the experimental treatment, David would die within 6 months. It was during one of these desperate late-night sessions that Margaret remembered something. 3 weeks ago, while cleaning Richard's private study, she had noticed his personal safe was open. This had never happened before in all her years of working for him. Richard was obsessively careful about security, the kind of man who changed. His passwords monthly and never left important documents lying around. But there it had been, the heavy steel door standing wide open, revealing neat stacks of cash bundled with rubber bands. Margaret had quickly looked away and finished her cleaning, assuming Richard would close it soon. But the image stayed with her, those green bundles representing more money than she had ever seen in one place. Now, sitting in her dimly lit kitchen, with David's medical bills spread before her like tarot cards predicting a terrible future, Margaret found herself thinking about that open safe again. She tried to push the thoughts away, telling herself that even considering such a thing meant she was losing her mind along with her son. But the thoughts kept coming back, especially during the long days at Richard's apartment. As she moved through her familiar routines, part of her mind was calculating, wondering, planning. She knew Richard's schedule better than anyone. She knew when he traveled, when he worked late, when he would and wouldn't be home. She also knew he was incredibly wealthy, the kind of rich where losing $300,000 might be like most people losing $300. Margaret had never stolen anything in her life, not even as a child. She was the woman who returned extra change at the grocery store, who had once driven across town to return a wallet she found in a taxi. Her mother had raised her to believe that integrity was more valuable than money, that your word was your bond, that good people didn't take things that didn't belong to them. But good people also didn't watch their children die when they might have the power to save them. As David grew weaker and the clock kept ticking, Margaret found herself standing at a crossroads she had never imagined she would face. On one side was everything she had been taught about right and wrong, about being an honest person living, an honest life. On the other side was her dying son and a chance to save him. The choice, when it came, would change everything. Not just for Margaret and David, but for Richard too, though none of them knew it yet. Sometimes the most ordinary people find themselves in extraordinary circumstances, forced to make decisions they never thought they would have to make. Sometimes desperation makes us do things we never imagined we were capable of doing. Margaret. Williams was about to become one of those people, and nothing would ever be the same again. The first time Margaret took money from the safe, her hands shook so badly she could barely count the bills. It was a Tuesday morning, and Richard had left early for a week-long business trip to Tokyo. She knew his schedule by heart. He wouldn't be back until the following Monday, giving her 5 full days before he might even think about checking the safe. Margaret stood in his study, staring at the open steel door that had haunted her thoughts for weeks. Inside, the money sat in neat stacks, each bundle wrapped with a simple rubber band. She had never seen so much cash in one place. To Richard, this was probably just petty cash, money he kept around for emergencies or quick business deals. To Margaret, it represented her son's entire future. She took $50,000 that first day, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might explode. The bills felt strange in her hands, heavier than regular money somehow. She carefully counted out the exact amount, then stared at the remaining stacks. Would Richard even notice? The safe was so full, and the money seemed almost forgotten. sitting there week after week. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She had hidden the money in a coffee tin in her freezer, wrapped in plastic bags like some kind of drug dealer from a movie. Every sound in her apartment made her jump. Every car that passed outside made her think the police were coming for her. She had become a thief, something she never thought possible. But then she thought about David in his hospital bed, getting weaker every day. She thought about the experimental treatment that could save him and how they were running out of time. The doctors had been clear. Without the treatment, David had maybe 4 months left. With it, he had a real chance at a normal life. The next week, Margaret took another $70,000. This time her hands were steadier, but her heart still raced. She had developed a system now, replacing the stolen money with newspaper cut to the exact same size and wrapped with identical rubber bands. From a distance, the safe looked exactly the same. Richard would have to actually pick up the bundles to realize they weren't real money anymore. Margaret told herself she was borrowing, not stealing. Once David got better, once he was in remission and could go back to school, she would find a way to pay it back. She would work extra jobs, sell everything she owned, do whatever it took. This was temporary, she convinced herself. This was about saving a life. The hardest part was lying to David. When she told him that the insurance company had finally approved the experimental treatment, his face lit up with a hope she hadn't seen in months. He actually cried, tears of relief streaming down his thin cheeks as he hugged her tight. "I knew you would figure something out, Mom," he whispered. "You always do." Margaret held him close, breathing in the antiseptic smell of the hospital that had become their second home. She was saving his life, she reminded herself. She was doing what any mother would do, but the guilt sat heavy in her chest, a constant weight that made it hard to breathe sometimes. The treatment began immediately. David was transferred to a specialized hospital in Boston, 3 hours away from their home in New York. The facility was like something from the future, all gleaming. Equipment and hopeful doctors who spoke about success rates and promising results. For the first time in months, Margaret allowed herself to believe that everything might actually be okay. She took more money each week, always careful, always methodical. 90,000 the third week, 60,000 the fourth week. She varied the amounts to make it seem more random, less like someone was systematically emptying the safe. By the end of the 5th week, she had taken $270,000. The treatment was brutal but effective. David spent most days hooked up to machines that pumped experimental drugs into his system. He lost more weight, lost what little hair he had left, but the doctors were cautiously optimistic. The cancer markers in his blood were dropping. His body was finally responding to treatment. Margaret split her time between Richard's apartment and the hospital in Boston. She would work her regular schedule, cleaning and organizing, then drive 3 hours to spend the evening with David. She slept in uncomfortable hospital chairs, ate vending machine food, and pretended everything was normal when Richard's friends or business partners visited the apartment. The guilt was eating her alive, but so was hope. For the first time since the diagnosis, David was talking about the future again. He wanted to finish high school, maybe go to college to study medicine so he could help other kids like him. He had color in his cheeks again, and his laugh didn't sound forced anymore. It was during the 7th week that everything changed. Margaret needed $70,000 more to complete David's treatment course. She had taken a total of $270,000, and the final payment was due to the hospital by Friday. She waited for Richard to leave for his morning meeting, then headed to his study as she had done so many times before. But this time was different. This time, someone else was there first. Jake Morrison, Richard's business partner and oldest friend, was standing in front of the open safe with a confused expression on his face. He was holding one of the fake money bundles, the newspaper clearly visible through a tear in the wrapping. Margaret froze in the doorway, her cleaning supplies clutched in her hands like weapons. Jake looked up at her, then back at the fake money bundle, then at her again. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the ticking of Richard's expensive grandfather clock in the corner. "Margaret," Jake said slowly, his voice careful and controlled. "Can you explain what this is?" Margaret's mind went completely blank. All her careful planning, all her methodical preparation, and she had never considered what would happen if someone else discovered her secret. She had been so focused on Richard's schedule that she had forgotten about his business partners, his friends, all the other people who might have access to his private study. She started, then stopped. What could she possibly say? How could she explain stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars? How could she make someone understand the desperation that had driven her to this point? Jake was already reaching for his phone. "I need to call Richard," he said, not taking his eyes off her. "And probably the police." The word police hit Margaret like a physical blow. Prison, court, lawyers. David would lose his treatment, would go back to dying slowly while she sat in a cell, unable to help him. Everything she had done, all the risk and guilt and sleepless nights, would be for nothing. "Please," she said, the word coming out as barely a whisper. "Please, let me explain." Jake paused, his finger hovering over his phone screen. Maybe it was something in her voice, or the way she looked like she was about to collapse. He had known Margaret for years, had watched her work quietly and efficiently in Richard's home. She had always seemed like the most honest person he had ever met. "You have 5 minutes," he said finally, "before I call Richard and tell him that his housekeeper has been stealing from him." Margaret sank into one of Richard's leather chairs, her legs unable to support her weight anymore. She looked at Jake, this man who had the power to destroy what was left of her world, and tried to find the words to explain the unexplainable. "My son is dying," she said simply, "and I'm trying to save him." As she began to tell her story, Margaret realized that her carefully constructed plan was falling apart. But maybe, just maybe, the truth might be her only chance at salvation. She had no idea that this moment would change not just her fate, but Richard's as well, in ways none of them could have imagined. The desperate act was over. Now came the reckoning. And Margaret could only hope that somewhere in the hearts of these wealthy, powerful men was room for understanding the lengths a mother would go to save her child. Richard Hartwell sat in his office chair, staring at the phone in his hands for 20 minutes after Jake's call ended. The conversation kept replaying in his mind. Margaret, his quiet, dependable housekeeper of 12 years, had stolen over $250,000 from his safe. The same woman who had once driven across Manhattan to return a $20 bill she found in his coat pocket. His first instinct was exactly what Jake expected. Call the police, press charges, let the legal system handle it. Margaret had committed a serious crime, and there had to be consequences. But something held him back. A nagging feeling in his chest that he couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was the way Jake had described her when she tried to explain. She looked broken, Richard, like someone who had run out of options. Or maybe it was the mention of her sick son, a detail that hit closer to home than Margaret could have known. Instead of calling the police, Richard found himself dialing a different number. Tommy Chen had been his private investigator for years, handling everything from background checks on potential business partners to finding information on companies he wanted to acquire. If anyone could dig up the truth about Margaret Williams, it was Tommy. "I need you to find out everything about someone," Richard said when Tommy answered. "But I need it fast, and I need it quiet." Within 6 hours, Tommy had sent the first report. As Richard read through the pages, his understanding of the woman who had silently served his family began to change completely. Margaret wasn't just a housekeeper who had made a terrible mistake. She was a woman whose entire world had been systematically destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. The medical records painted a heartbreaking picture. David Williams, age 16, diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 6 months ago. Standard treatments had failed. The experimental therapy at Boston Children's Hospital was his last real hope, but insurance companies had denied coverage twice, calling it investigational and not medically necessary. Richard found himself reading the insurance denial letters, filled with cold corporate language that reduced a dying teenager to policy numbers and risk assessments. He had dealt with insurance companies in his business dealings and knew how they operated, but seeing it applied to a child's life made his stomach turn. The financial records told an even more devastating story. Margaret had exhausted every possible option. She had taken out a second mortgage on her small Brooklyn apartment. She had maxed out credit cards she had never used before. She had applied for 17 different medical grants and been rejected by all of them. She had even started selling her belongings, letting go of family heirlooms and personal items that had taken a lifetime to collect. Tommy's investigation revealed that Margaret had tried to reach out for help in ways Richard never knew about. She had called several wealthy families she had worked for in the past, swallowing her pride to ask for loans she promised to pay back over years. Most had politely declined or simply never returned her calls. A few had sent small amounts, 100 here, 500 there, drops in an ocean of need. The most shocking discovery came when Tommy found a crumpled letter in Margaret's apartment, hidden in her desk drawer. She had tried to write to Richard himself, explaining her situation and asking for help. The letter was half-finished, covered in tear stains and crossed-out words where she had struggled to find the right way to ask for charity from the man she worked for. "Dear Mr. Hartwell," it began, "I have worked for your family for 12 years. And I have never asked for anything beyond my salary. But my son is dying, and I don't know where else to turn. I would work for free for the rest of my life if you could help us now. I know this is not appropriate, and I understand if you cannot help, but I am running out of options and time." She had never sent it. Tommy found several versions, each one started and abandoned as Margaret struggled with her pride and her desperation. She had been too afraid to cross the invisible line between employer and employee, too worried about losing the job that was her only source of income. Richard found himself driving to the hospital in Boston without really deciding to go. He told the staff he was a potential donor interested in learning about their experimental programs, a lie that came easier than he expected. What he found there shook him to his core. David Williams was nothing like what Richard had imagined. Despite being obviously ill, the teenager was articulate, curious, and surprisingly optimistic. He spoke passionately about wanting to become a doctor someday, specifically to work with kids facing cancer. "My mom always told me that when bad things happen to us, we can either let them make us bitter or use them to help other people," David explained as they sat in the hospital's common area. "I figure if I beat this thing, I should spend my life making sure other families don't have to go through what we've been through." Richard watched this 16-year-old boy talk about his future with a maturity that many adults never achieve. David had no idea that his treatment was being funded by stolen money. He believed, as his mother had told him, that insurance had finally approved the experimental therapy after months of appeals. "My mom is amazing," David continued, his face lighting up as he talked about Margaret. "She never let me see her scared, even though I know she was. She worked so hard to make this happen. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making her proud." The guilt Richard felt in that moment was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Here was this remarkable young man, fighting for his life with grace and dignity, while his mother faced potential prison time for trying to save him. Richard realized he was partially responsible for Margaret's desperation. If he had been a more present, caring employer, she might have felt comfortable asking him for help instead of resorting to theft. Tommy's investigation also revealed Margaret's history with previous employers. Every single person who had worked with her described her as scrupulously honest. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman Margaret had cared for years ago, still remembered how Margaret had insisted on returning a valuable ring she found while cleaning, even though Mrs. Patterson had told her to keep it. That woman has more integrity in her little finger than most people have in their whole body, Mrs. Patterson had told Tommy. If Margaret Williams took something that didn't belong to her, you can bet she had a damn good reason. The neighbors in Margaret's Brooklyn apartment building painted a picture of someone who went out of her way to help others. She tutored children for free, helped elderly residents with their groceries, and organized community cleanups. She had been the unofficial caretaker of their small building for years, never asking for anything in return. Richard found himself thinking about his own son, Michael, who had died in a car accident 5 years earlier. He remembered the desperate feeling of helplessness, the way he would have done anything, paid any amount, made any deal to save his child's life. The difference was that Richard had had options. He had money, connections, power. Margaret had none of those things. As he sat in his office late that night, surrounded by Tommy's reports and his own conflicted thoughts, Richard realized something that changed everything. Margaret Williams wasn't a criminal who had betrayed his trust. She was a mother who had been failed by every system that should have protected her family. The insurance companies, the medical system, the social safety net, even Richard himself as an employer who had remained blind to her struggles. The question now wasn't whether to press charges. The question was what kind of man Richard wanted to be. He could follow the letter of the law and watch a desperate mother go to prison while her son's treatment was discontinued. Or he could do something that would surprise everyone who thought they knew the ruthless businessman. Richard Hartwell was about to make a decision that would change 3 lives forever. But first he needed to have a conversation with Margaret Williams, one that was long overdue and would reveal truths that neither of them was prepared to hear. The investigation was complete, but the real test of character was just beginning. Margaret hadn't slept in 3 days. Ever since Jake discovered her secret, she had been waiting for the other shoe to drop. Every knock on her apartment door, every phone call, every unexpected sound made her heart race. She knew Richard was back from his business trip. She knew Jake had told him everything. She was just waiting for the police to arrive. Instead, on Thursday morning, she found Richard sitting quietly in his kitchen when she arrived for work. He was drinking coffee from his usual blue ceramic mug, but something was different. For the first time in years, he actually looked at her when she walked into the room. "Good morning, Margaret," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Could you sit down, please? We need to talk." Margaret's legs felt like water, but she managed to lower herself into the chair across from him. This was it. He was going to fire her, call the police, destroy what was left of her life. David would lose his treatment, and she would go to prison. Everything she had risked, everything she had sacrificed, would be for nothing. "I know about David," Richard said simply. "I know about the cancer, the denied insurance claims, the experimental treatment. I know everything." Margaret waited for the anger, the accusations, the threats of legal action. Instead, Richard reached across the table and placed a check in front of her. Her eyes widened as she saw the amount, $400,000. "What is this?" she whispered. "It's enough to complete David's treatment and cover any additional care he might need," Richard said. "No strings attached, no repayment necessary, just a gift from one parent to another." Margaret stared at the check, unable to process what was happening. This wasn't how the story was supposed to end. Rich people didn't just forgive theft and write checks to save the children of their employees. This had to be some kind of trick, some elaborate way of making her confession before he had her arrested. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely audible. Richard leaned back in his chair, and Margaret saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Vulnerability. "5 years ago, I lost my son Michael in a car accident. He was 19, had his whole life ahead of him. For months afterward, I would have done anything to bring him back. I would have sold everything I owned, broken any law, made any deal, with any devil. I would have stolen from anyone if it meant saving his life. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she began to understand. The difference between us, Richard continued, is that I never had to make that choice. When Michael was hurt, money wasn't an issue. I had the best doctors, the best hospitals, every possible resource. None of it mattered in the end, but at least I never had to choose between my child's life and my principles. Margaret was crying. Now, 12 years of careful professional distance crumbling in an instant. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I never meant to betray your trust. I just didn't know what else to do." "You don't need to apologize to me," Richard said gently. "I need to apologize to you. You've been part of my life for 12 years, and I never really saw you as a person with your own struggles and dreams and fears. You were just the woman who made my life run smoothly. I should have known what you were going through. I should have been the kind of employer you felt comfortable talking to." But Richard's response went far beyond just covering David's medical bills. Over the next few weeks, he quietly set up a medical trust fund in David's name, ensuring the boy would never have to worry about healthcare costs for the rest of his life. He also established something he called the Second Chances Foundation, dedicated to helping families facing medical bankruptcy. The most shocking part came when Richard Zopt offered Margaret a new job, not as his housekeeper, but as the director of his new foundation. The salary was more than triple what she had been earning, with benefits that included full medical coverage for her entire family. "I need someone who understands what it's like to be desperate," Richard explained. "Someone who knows what it feels like when the system fails you. You'll help identify families who need help and make sure they get it before they reach the point where they feel like they have no other options." Margaret's first case was a single father whose daughter needed a heart transplant. The insurance company was denying coverage, claiming the procedure was too expensive. Within a week, Margaret had arranged for full coverage through the foundation. She knew exactly how to navigate the system because she had been failed by it herself. David's treatment was a complete success. 6 months later, he was in full remission, back in school, and already talking about applying to colleges with strong pre-med programs. He still had no idea that his mother had stolen money to save his life. As far as he knew, insurance had finally come through after a long battle. Margaret had insisted on paying back every penny of the original money she took, even though Richard had told her it wasn't necessary. She set up a payment plan that would take her 5 years to complete, money that Richard immediately donated to children's hospitals around the country. The story eventually made its way to the media, though Richard kept Margaret's identity private. News outlets picked up on the unusual tale of a wealthy businessman who had responded to employee theft not with prosecution, but with compassion and systemic change. Some criticized Richard, saying he was encouraging criminal behavior. Others praised him for recognizing the difference between desperation and greed. Richard didn't care about the critics. He held a press conference where he spoke honestly about his own privilege and blindness to the struggles of people who had been part of his daily life for years. "We live in a society where people die because they can't afford health care," he said to the assembled reporters, "where parents have to choose between following the law and saving their children's lives. The real crime isn't what my employee did. The real crime is that she felt she had to do it." The Second Chances Foundation grew quickly, helping hundreds of families navigate medical crises without facing financial ruin. Margaret became something of an expert in dealing with insurance companies and medical billing departments, using her natural determination and newfound resources to fight for families who couldn't fight for themselves. 2 years later, Richard and Margaret had developed a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. She still worked in his home sometimes, but now as a friend rather than an employee. They would sit in his kitchen, drinking coffee and planning the foundation's next initiatives. "Do you ever regret not pressing charges?" Margaret asked him one morning. Richard considered the question as he watched David through the window playing basketball in the courtyard below. The teenager was healthy, strong, and full of life. He was volunteering at the local children's hospital and had just been accepted to 3 different colleges. Never, Richard said finally. Pressing charges would have destroyed 3 lives and changed nothing about the system that created the problem in the first place. This way, we've saved 1 life and hopefully prevented other families from facing the same impossible choice you did. Margaret nodded, thinking about all the families they had helped since the foundation began. Parents who no longer had to choose between their children's health and their financial stability. Kids who got the treatment they needed without their families going bankrupt. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think that taking that money was the worst thing I had ever done. Now I think it might have been the best thing, not because stealing is right, but because it led to all of this. It led to David being healthy, to other families getting help, to you and me working together to fix a broken system." Richard smiled, remembering the cold, isolated man he had been before Margaret's desperate act had opened his eyes to the struggles of people beyond his privileged world. Sometimes the most profound changes come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes what looks like betrayal is actually a cry for help that changes everyone involved. The shocking response had become a new beginning, proving that sometimes the greatest act of justice is not punishment, but understanding the desperation that drives people to their breaking point, and then working to make sure no one else has to reach that point again.